Thanks, Nigel. So we always say at these events that the community events are always the presentations are the most important. Give us your session and we'll give you all the time you need. And then the guy that's doing one has just been told he needs to shave 5 minutes off it. So how fickle are we? So the next presentation is Sean Corrigan. He's presented here before. This is now part 2. He's famous for his slide decks, and I'm sure he won't disappoint this time. So Sean.
Cheers, very generous intro, thank you very much. Good morning everyone, hello, good to be here, good to see you all. Some familiar faces, some not so familiar faces. Hello and welcome, cloud migration at scale, Tales from the Field, part 2. So yes, I did an initial talk here last time. Incredibly was invited back again, so thanks very much. And today, I'm going to be presenting part 2 essentially, quite different. They're not really part 1 and 2, they're 2 different things, but we'll go into that in a minute. So who am I? My name's Sean Corrigan. It's been about 15 years an end user. I don't consider myself to be a real engineer right now. My current role is very much not at the coalface. It's kind of in a delivery type role. One thing that's very important today is I'm not currently representing my employer. Because they don't want me to come and do these things for some reason. So I'm here as Path to Cloud, which is my company. My actual company, who I can't mention by name, are a large Swiss bank that still exist. So that's them. Major apologies. This is very Azure heavy. Our platform that I work on every day is on Azure. Also, it's quite text and talk heavy, so apologies, I don't have that many. In fact, I don't have any architectural diagrams, which are probably of interest. And I've also been asked to shave 5 minutes off, so the fast talking may or may not increase even more than it was before. So, what is the subject I'm going to talk to you about today? So it's basically the concepts around how potentially you could scale to 100,000 users and beyond. Actually, the concepts still apply to much smaller environments in Azure. So even if you're looking to deploy more than probably a couple of thousand users in single region within Azure, hopefully you can still learn something from me today. Hopefully it's obvious, but I won't be presenting the exact setup that I use at my current job. I'm really trying to present more kind of generic building blocks you can use to build these environments at scale on Azure. Always have a plan. Seems kind of obvious. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but certainly I've been pushed over the last 2 to 3 years to kind of get to a more, people love using the word agile, more agile way of working. I really feel like in the EUC space, a lot of us have had to be very agile across our careers anyway, just because EUC is that kind of space. But it's always good to have a plan. If you need to apply agility, apply your agility to the delivery of your plan and not your planning. Why should you listen to me around this? Probably because I've just onboarded our 100,000th user onto Azure recently. And I have found probably every way how not to do that, I think. So we'll kind of gloss over that.
Did they get a prize?
Sorry?
Did they get a prize? You're 100,000th user, not the champagne.
You're wasted here now. So always have a plan. It's not always possible, but try and design ahead of time. And if you're going to do anything agile, deliver that plan in an agile fashion and kind of cover off the use cases. Obviously, you're always going to have stuff that kind of appears last minute, but just try. Standards. Standards are super important. I have some more notes that I can't see on this screen because my text is too large. When Neil sends the deck out at some point, there are some links around standards. So what does that relate to? Primarily naming standards. Naming standards are very important. Certainly Microsoft has some best practices around namings. There's also a GitHub with resource available that you can run to kind of generate your standardized naming. We started off not following that because that wasn't really a big thing 3 or 4 years ago. So I have some items that are now not standard name, and actually it's come round to fruition that we probably need to go back and revisit that. But just to be key, standards are super important. It will serve as the base for you to be able to deliver your plan. And if you do get those kind of unexpected requirements coming up, you'll be in a position to expand without kind of tripping over yourself. So having that kind of naming standards and standards around your design is super important for success. Final bit, scripts are cool, code is cooler. So when you're deploying at scale, or even if you're not deploying at scale actually, we've probably all come from worlds where stuff was getting hand cranked and then maybe you moved on to some kind of basic scripting, whether that was, I don't know, VB script, or maybe you moved on to PowerShell, maybe you're moving on to some of these more modern deployment methods. If you're doing anything at any kind of scale, I would always recommend moving into, again, agile modern working practices of beginning to look at things like GitHub, GitLab pipelines, ADO in Azure, Azure DevOps, all of those kind of things. Moving to a world of code is going to put you in a really good position in terms of repeatability. It's going to really reduce your config drift, all those kind of good things. And to be honest, without that approach, I think there's no way we would have been able to deliver what we've been able to deliver over the last couple of years. I'm not going to talk about that at length at all in this session, because I think probably it would be good to get someone in to talk about that for 45 minutes one day. Who that's going to be, I don't know. Definitely not me, because I don't work at the coalface. But yeah, I might be able to get someone. We'll see. So what are your basic building blocks? Well, in Azure, so again, apologies, very Azure heavy. Let's refer to some of the basics. Got zones, regions, and regions. So that's kind of tripped us up in a lot of conversations. A lot of stuff we used to term regions are now actually geos. So you'll have multiple Azure regions which kind of form a geo essentially. So I don't know, North and West Europe is your two regions, but we just call that the EU geography, at least internally. Management groups and subscriptions, kind of stuff you need to watch out for there. Anything that's happening on networking, images, hosting resources, applications, all of the normal stuff that you need to go through to essentially build your environment. So these are the things we'll be talking through today. Right, so first point, zones, regions, and geos. For me, it's really interesting. Tom may throttle me in a minute. There's an extreme focus at the moment from not just Microsoft, a lot of other vendors getting desktops close to the user, which is brilliant. I totally get that. I'm on board with that. Getting the kind of developer use cases, if you've got kind of artist use cases, CAD, whatever. Anyone that really needs that local PC type experience, cloud is amazing, right? You can get the desktops really close to the user. Actually, in enterprise finance, it's really important for me to not get the desktop that close to the user, but to get their terrible, terrible app that was written in 1999 very close to the horribly written SQL database. Because if it's not near there, you will experience major problems. So those are the kind of two different worlds that you're going to need to balance depending on your use case. Work out what geographies you need to go into, work out what regions you're going to use, see if they have facilities that are available that satisfy your requirements. Certainly there are multiple regions within Azure right now that don't have availability zones. If availability zones is something that you need for your design, you're going to have to speak to your Azure account manager, find out if they're actually coming online with multiple availability zones, or you're going to have to be pushed to a different region that has multiple availability zones. Moving on to that, resilience. It's a key part of your design. Some of the region pairs in Azure are not latency friendly. Examples, East US 2 and Central US, or East US 1 and West US. These places are nowhere near each other. So again, if you need good app performance and low latency, having your DR region halfway across an entire continent is not a great use for you unless all of your apps will also follow that model. So that's something to bear in mind. It's something that you're going to have to be very conscious of when you're making these kind of design decisions around how you're going to architect and build your environment. And then also playing into that is costs. Don't forget about costs. I mean, it sounds pretty obvious, right? Everyone knows that cloud is not super duper cheap. It's actually really mega expensive, and you're going to get nickel and dimed for every feature and every piece of technology that you use within cloud, because it's at the click of a button, which is kind of why we're all being forced to go there. At least we are in my world. So be very aware of any cost implications when you decide to either stay in geography or you spread your environment out between between regions in a geography. Sometimes there are some quite large cost differences between different regions in the same geography, and also be aware that depending on how much capacity Tom has guaranteed at any point in time, certain SKUs may or may not be significantly more expensive than other SKUs, which will also play into kind of how you end up having to build your environment, end up with the overall cost of your environment. So just be aware that cost is not constant, it's always changing, and there may be things that you had set in your mind at some point that actually when you look at it again, maybe there's a better option. Maybe you can put some resources in, I don't know, West Europe and other resources in Germany, for example. I don't know, but just be aware of that. Management groups and subscriptions. I'm going to gloss over the tenancy piece. Obviously, tenancy is important, especially in a cloud workspace. Largely, the devil's in the detail, and it's kind of mainly around Microsoft SaaS services. Tenancy doesn't really play a large part in terms of splitting your environment out and having an influence on kind of how you would want to build that environment out. It's generally single tenant a lot of the time. So management groups, what are they good for? For me, they're good for getting top-level segregation to form other parts of your Azure estate. Microsoft do recommend going slightly further than that. There's quite a lot of examples around kind of segregating your environment out further with multiple kind of trees of management groups to potentially segregate different parts of your business from each other. I think that's more of a generic approach, which is fine if you're building an entire platform for everything within your business. If you're focused more around the EUC piece, absolutely segregate it using a management group and have that essentially acting as, I don't know, let's go into the old world, acting as the root level of kind of your AD. And then everything that sits inside of that management group is then kind of off to the side as your end user environment, whether that's session hosts or management machines, whatever. I feel like they're good for providing that level of segregation. Don't be tempted to go too granular. Management groups are not OUs. There is quite a lot of flexibility in them, but we have fast found that by going too deep in that tree, again, you will trip yourself up and you'll have to undo stuff. Microsoft actually have been quite good about moving stuff around now. 5 years ago, whenever we were first looking into this, things were not as flexible. Types of subscriptions. You might be thinking, well, basically one, really. How many types of subs are there in Azure? There's generally one that we're interested in our use case. I'm sure someone here is going to have some very niche exceptions to that, but types of subscriptions we've got. What I'm talking about is how do you utilize your subscriptions? How do you split those up? So generally, you could go one of two ways. I personally would advise going from a pod type model. So per region, you would have one management subscription. That's the subscription you use to stand up all of your kind of management type machines, whether that's, I don't know, for example, Citrix brokers, whether that's AppV publishing servers, RIP in October, or any other kind of servers that you currently utilize to provide kind of the nuts and bolts to hang your environment together. Things like storage accounts are super important. Those kind of things that are used by any of the kind of session hosts within your environment, whether that's shared hosted or VDIs, sit those inside your management subscription. And for the rest of the subscriptions, begin to populate those with pretty much purely VDIs or session hosts. And then you've got a very good basic structure there so that if you need to scale out, instead of having to constantly stand up new things, you can just stand up individual, pretty much identical subscriptions with very similar resource inside all of them and scale out horizontally, which is kind of the expected design these days. It's kind of been used as a design pattern for Citrix and VMware for years. It's the one that kind of Microsoft recommend in conjunction with Citrix as well. So that's it fits well. Apologies, I don't have a generic picture of that. I do have some links that are in my new presentation that will show you some of that. So when Sunil sends that out afterwards, you can have a look at those. How many do you need? Very requirement based. How many subscriptions do you need? How many users do you have? How many places do you need to go? What do you need to support? Would I recommend spanning subscriptions over multiple regions? You can, but probably not. Just because in terms of if there's any issues with a particular subscription, by kind of modularizing that and putting individual subscriptions into individual regions, you're kind of reducing the blast radius of things that could potentially cause problems. Yeah, that's just my advice for that. I did have more notes, but again, they're off the screen. So, networking. General concepts. Oh, thank you very much, sir. There we go. Yes, now we're talking. As if. So I'm not going to talk about broker stacks because, again, very generic. It's kind of almost commodity at this point. But hub and spoke topologies, generally, it will keep things manageable, especially when you're using things like express routes. I'll probably talk about them a little bit more later. So essentially, you'll have a core hub, which links back to your express routes, which will take your traffic back to on-prem or elsewhere, potentially. And your spokes will essentially be your kind of child networks where your resources sit. So whether that's items that are in your management area or if that's session hosts and VDIs, that's the kind of accepted model. The scaling on that at the moment is not amazing. So there is a limit there, which we'll probably go into. Around peering, peering for mainly performance. Peering will reduce latency, it will remove a lot of routing overhead, especially for what is kind of traditionally north-south traffic, so anything that's going from your kind of VDIs up and down to your storage, all of those kind of central services that we've been talking about. Directly peering your VDI subscriptions into your management subscriptions will reduce a lot of that overhead. If you're doing kind of funky stuff like cross-region replication using non-native mechanisms, so let's just say you have some Azure Files Premium storage accounts and you have built some tooling to move that data over to a different region or a different part of the world. Peering those VNets together can seriously reduce the latency and the impact of performance whilst you're doing those things. Also be aware, there is a tool called Azure Virtual Network Manager, which makes things like cross-sub peering and all that kind of stuff a lot more manageable. Azure Virtual Network Manager doesn't actually work with all services in Azure right now. The primary one that stands out is Azure NetApp files. Anything that relies on kind of physical kit within the Azure data centers isn't really supported right now, so something to be aware of. Private endpoints, generally speaking, it's a good thing to enable on all your networks. It ensures as many Microsoft native services as possible are essentially treated as being moved onto your own networks instead of the kind of generic Azure kind of essentially public IPs. I'm not sure if it's a problem that everyone in this room runs into a lot, but I, as part of a highly regulated industry, have to have a lot of conversations with a lot of security people using things like private endpoints. Generally makes those security conversations a lot easier. There is a cost to it. It's not massive unless you're moving petabytes of data around. But again, cloud costs, just be aware that that's a thing. Network security groups. There are multiple ways you can secure your traffic. Network security groups is just one of them. It's essentially a firewall, but you can set it yourself. For me, it's proven really useful as a kind of line of demarcation. As an EUC function, we don't have full control over everything in the business. There's other business units that look after kind of Azure control plane and management infra and all those kind of things. Obviously, we also have very large networking teams that currently look after the on-prem firewalls, all that kind of stuff. And generally speaking, their responsibility is also for the Azure firewalls. If you need control over your solution, have a look at NSGs, very useful. You can apply them quite granularly. Again, it makes security conversations a lot easier if you're actively able to present some of the things that you're doing and working on yourself than having to rely on other departments within your business to present for you. One thing to watch out for, if you're using NSGs and you're also using things like private endpoints or user-defined routes or application security groups, you have to set a policy in place. Otherwise, your NSGs basically won't do anything, which is not ideal. I don't know why that's not the default, but it's not. Express routes. Express routes, not sure if everyone's familiar with those. Essentially, the pipe going back to a lot of your stuff on-prem to local POP or through a local POP. At the top, on the Azure end, you have these virtual network gateways that sit at the end of Express route. Essentially just big virtual machines that sit in Azure and software-defined networking devices. Make sure that they're big enough for your deployment. They are scalable, so you don't have to start off big, you can start off small. But it's one thing that people do regularly get wrong that I've seen. One of the big things is around IP addresses. Each of those different sizes of virtual network gateways is only able to support up to a certain number of IP addresses. So at the moment, I believe the very largest is only able to support 11,000 IPs, which obviously if you're looking to deploy 30 or 40,000 people in a single region, it's not going to do it for you. So you need to have a think about that and your virtual network gateways and how big they are. Kind of a standard design that we use is 5 subscriptions of 2,000 users each, gives you a nice little kind of 10K pod there. And the first of those pods that we deploy into a region also has the management stuff. So that extra 1,000 IPs there's generally enough to kind of get you over the line. And then if you need to kind of break out past that, deploy another VNG, another set of networks, all that kind of stuff. Could you go bigger with the subscriptions? Yeah, you probably could go slightly bigger with the subscriptions. The reason I've broken it down to a smaller number than that is generally around subscription level APIs. There's quite a lot of things that happen at that level where 2,000 machines is enough. Also, 2,000 is just below a nice subnet number. So you're running around deploying lots of /20 runs rather than kind of a 21 and maybe like a /23 or similar to kind of get to the correct scaling levels there. There is a new virtual network gateway coming called Gateway Scale, which is in preview at the moment, which again, you can leave in place and will scale up to something like 40 or 60,000 IP addresses, again in blocks of 2,000 IPs, so that will work well for us. We're not looking at that right now, but that's something that's available. And finally, FastPath. So kind of ignore the last minute or two of chat. FastPath is great if you've still got lots of resources on-prem. I'm going to presume most of you do. There's very few of us that are full cloud native right now. For a lot of that traffic, FastPath essentially means you're going to be able to shortcut the traffic outside of your virtual network gateways, meaning that you can also bypass those IP address limitations in terms of routing ability. Be aware that should something happen to the FastPath service, you will drop back to that 11,000 IP limit in terms of routing. So that's why we haven't looked at that yet. But also, it doesn't support global peering. So if you're looking at doing things like I said, the kind of out of region or out of geo replication for peering, FastPath will not support that. So just be aware of that. Next, images, OSs, things like that. Everyone's going to need some kind of OS, despite people telling us that you're going to have a web desktop for the last 10 years. You've got a load of tools at your disposal. If you want to keep it Microsoft focused, the obvious option there is Azure Image Builder. It's not available in some regions, but it doesn't actually matter, to be honest, and I'll get onto that in a minute. There are some limitations with Azure Image Builder, as well as the fact that it's not available in some regions. But under the hood, it's actually just HashiCorp Packer with some guardrails. So if you find it a little bit too restrictive, there's some things in there that maybe don't work for you. It is possible to kind of move on to something like HashiCorp Packer, which will enable you to kind of transition out of that AIB space into something a little bit more flexible. Don't ask me what's going to happen after the IBM acquisition now that it's gone through, but for the moment, HashiCorp Packer is still there. But like I said, there's a lot of tools there. I think my main advice would be certainly there's something to be said for sticking to what you know. There's a confidence level there, but with all of this transitional stuff, don't be afraid to kind of push yourself and move. We used to use all of the kind of traditional tooling on-prem to build our images, and now we are 100% HashiCorp Packer. If we could make it work on Azure Image Builder, we would be using Azure Image Builder. It's just there. It's under the hood. It's first party. If anything goes wrong, we can pick up the phone and call someone. It's good. It works for us. So moving on to it not being available in some regions, but not really being relevant. Why is it not relevant? Well, because of Azure Compute Gallery. You can essentially build your images pretty much anywhere and use some of the built-in global replication to get that image to local galleries in any of your regions, in any of your subscriptions. So again, the Azure Compute Gallery is a kind of resource that I would sit inside of that management subscription so that it's available. There are a number of limitations at a subscription level in terms of kind of the number of images you can build, the number of versions there. But generally speaking, the limits on that are quite high. I don't think it's something that you would run into. So be aware that there are kind of limitations around it, but don't worry too much that they're quite high. You don't need to worry about that. You may need to speak to Microsoft and specifically request access to Image Gallery in some regions, but generally speaking, it's globally available. There are some recommendations there. So talking about performance, if you are in the business of regularly building, destroying and rebuilding machines for whatever reason, whether they're persistent, non-persistent, anything, generally speaking, the recommendation is to go 20:1 on your replica to VMs. So if you've got 2,000 VMs, make sure you've got 100 replicas in your image gallery, and that will vastly improve your performance in terms of build. Sure tooling, if you've got some of that over the top, things like Nerdio, they can already do that stuff for you. So yeah, to be honest, that's pretty much all I've got to say around performance. It just works. But yeah, make sure you've got enough replicas and make sure your image gallery is replicated local to where your workloads are and where you want to build them. That will cover off most of your problems with the image piece. Resilience, again, pretty simple. You can just use ZRS storage, which means you're going to have a copy in each of the 3 availability zones, assuming the region has availability zones, to protect against a zonal failure. Do you need to support a regional failure? Not really. Just replicate your image gallery into a different region and you're protected, so that's all good. Right, hosting resources. How are we going to break that down? Resource groups. So essentially we use them to sensibly pocket and segregate the environment into different use cases. Why do we do that? Because actually we hold almost like I hold back to before about the management groups. For me, resource groups are more like OUs. They're more useful for holding similar pockets of items in. Maybe you've got a group of machines that need the same settings, all that kind of stuff. Internally, we use them for kind of ring-style deployments. So we segregate individual pockets and machines, similar to like Insider or whatever. Some of you might be doing kind of red-green type deployments or green-blue type deployments, where you're kind of flicking between different entire pools for versioning. We kind of expanded upon that and have kind of multiple sets of rings. So we kind of have one ring, which is core users. That's kind of app testers, business champions, all that kind of stuff. And they're forced to basically test the next version of the image kind of 2 weeks ahead of everyone else. Week after that, ring it out to the next ring. And then after that, goes out to the whole of the business. Resource groups are super useful for that because we don't have to do anything to the VMs themselves. At management plane level, it's the same machine, it's the same image, same everything. All that happens is we drop the machines in a different resource group, and the resource group has, I'm going to go over myself again now. We have tags against the resource group, and the tags drive a lot of the configuration of the items within the machine there, so super useful. Machine catalogs, host pools, whatever you want to call them. At scale, it's generally easy to dedicate entire subscriptions to use cases as long as they're relatively large or share similar settings. If you have a bulk of your environment that is kind of like that, and you just have a pocket of, I don't know, 5 or 10 very small use cases, maybe consider dedicating a subscription to all of your weird and wonderful use cases. We found it really helps with troubleshooting and management. As soon as people go into that particular subscription, they're like, oh, this is the weird one. Be careful, things are not standard here, etc., etc. Certainly before we had them kind of here, there, and everywhere, and it got very confusing for the support guys very quickly, which wasn't ideal, especially when you're having to host over 100,000 users. Disks, generally speaking, you're going to be using some kind of managed disk there. Ensure you're aware of any restrictions or hidden costs. Where are the hidden costs? Well, we found out standard SSD has a number of essentially IOPS related fees against it. So just be aware that if you go with standard SSD rather than standard hard drive or premium SSD, that there is potentially another cost you're inviting to have to pay for, which you may not be aware of under the hood. Tags I've kind of gone to a little bit, but it's an amazing resource to have available. I absolutely recommend using tags as much as possible if they're available in your environment. There is an internal Azure metadata service, which you can query using a REST API. So if you set tags against any resource, generally speaking, but specifically in our use case, the end user resource, you can query that service and it will report back to the local machine what tags have been set and what the values of those tags are. Be aware of the limitations in terms of the characters, so that's length, types of characters, and the limitation of the fact you can only have 50 key value pairs per resource. Again, if you're going super granular, 50 may be a limit. We're not quite that granular. We're probably only about 10 or 15. One thing that's really useful in that area is the fact that it is possible to use inheritance, again, with the AD parallels and OU structures. Really useful to float down kind of shared tags from subscriptions to resource groups and then down into resources, or you can block inheritance at the root level and kind of start your inheritance starting at kind of the resource group level, which is what we tend to do. So anything that gets dropped into a resource group automatically inherits all of the tags from that resource group, and essentially we use that to drive the settings within the machines. So we have literally 3 types of machines, I think, 3 images, and the other 2 images are only because we have to support weird and wonderful language options. But essentially we drop the machine into a resource group, and everything about that machine, the setup, where it's going for its storage, all of the configuration files it requires to set the environment up, all that kind of stuff, that's all handled by the tags that are on the resource group. Image types, just think about your estate and the use cases, what's going to affect how you batch your image types. Ensure you consider the implications of going persistent or non-persistent and the suitability for those use cases. If you do go persistent, do you just go with Windows 365? I don't know. Feels pretty good right now, I have to say. I think a couple of years ago when it first appeared, a number of us were scratching our heads a little bit. And that space has massively improved over the last couple of years. Certainly the features that Tom's presented today, super interesting, makes it a real player. Again, that's a subject we could probably talk about for an entire session, so I won't go into it that much.
If you don't want to do the other 5 slides that you've already gone through, then Windows 365 is
absolutely right.
an option, right? Yeah.
Where'd you begin? Quotas and SKUs. So yeah, one thing that I've run into a number of times, probably every week for the last 2 years. Make sure you've got enough quota available at the regional and at the SKU level for the SKUs that you need. I could do a whole session on capacity issues on Azure. It would be super boring, but you would be astounded at how many issues I've had in the last 2 years around capacity and SKUs. So obviously be aware that in addition to the cost piece around those SKUs, make sure that you have enough SKUs available in your region to satisfy your use case. A lot of people start off deploying on a SKU and then find out that they can't get another, I don't know, let's just say 25,000 cores, and they have to transition to a different SKU. I'm not sure how complicated that journey looks like in your businesses, but for me it's a bit of a slog. We have to shove it through performance engineering, lots of things have to be tested. One thing that's come in very recently is going from a version 5 SKU to a version 6 SKU on a number of the popular SKU families within Azure, so that's kind of A&D and Intel D and E series. There's quite a few changes under the hood on how the storage connects, so you're going to have to update your image pipelines and all that kind of stuff to get those things working, so just be aware that's something that can catch you up. I'm not going to go too much into costs at all. Just be aware that obviously there are things like reserved instance and savings plan. Also be very aware that things like reserved instance are against a certain version of a SKU. So if you're on a SKU and you lock it in for 3 years and they suddenly get a new version of a chip that is cheaper and faster, you're not going to be able to move onto those SKUs because you're already locked in for 3 years on the others. Dedicated host for security and guaranteed availability. Is security a big play there? I don't think it is, but you know what? It makes security people happy. And guaranteed availability is the big one. A number of our regions, we kind of run active, so we have the quota and the capacity to spin up, let's just say 40,000 users in each region, but at any point in time, we probably have 20,000 users running in one region and 20,000 users running in the other region. If we lost the region, would we be able to turn on the other 20,000 machines? Hopefully. It's very much a fastest finger conversation. Again, Tom presented that is an option now on 365, which is interesting, to guarantee that availability. It's always been available on Azure. It's not cheap, but it is there. Hybrid or native domain join. This is something that comes up all the time, obviously, because it's super important. Generally speaking, at the moment, I think most of you are probably using hybrid domain join for a number of scenarios. Mainly due to some of the legacy authentication pieces. Can you go cloud native? Again, I think that space has really improved a lot recently. There's some technologies that you already have that you may need to support, and it's just easier going hybrid for now. I've seen some very interesting presentations in the last couple of months around what people are doing with native domain join. So I think from my point of view, make sure you listen to those people, because it's very interesting to hear about some of the situations where you actually can go cloud native, where perhaps maybe you thought you needed hybrid domain join. Certainly there's a number of services there that are available that will enable you to make the transition to, let's just say, a cloud native workspace with cloud native domain join, but also being able to use, I can't remember what it's called now, it's the Cloud Kerberos something, which will mean you'll be able to get Kerberos tokens issued for your cloud-only resources, but be able to use those to authenticate against items on-prem. Applications, massive. Again, could spend 4 weeks on this. Classic EUC conundrum. How do you deliver and manage your apps in your estate? There's a lot of options. Unfortunately, at scale, unless you're running really large pockets of very similar users, maybe you run the world's largest call center, I don't know. The approach is to kind of deliver your applications using some kind of virtualization, or to just fat package the apps and deliver them to persistent machines. As we know, if you virtualize your apps, it comes with quite a few compromises, including sometimes some quite significant performance impacts. That's something to be aware of. Enhanced options. Is Jim here? I spotted him earlier, I think he's outside. Enhanced options for certain app vendors. So obviously that's very much in Jim's space. We've got app attach for things like Liquidware Flex app, Omnissa app volumes, and Cloud Pager from Numescent are all really good options for virtualizing your app estate. And there are native mechanisms in there now that mean things like publishing server for app v disappearing are not quite as critical as they were maybe 6 months ago. Despite being told that it's the future, MSIX for app attach still has quite a lot of limitations. I'm not sure how many people are doing stuff in MSIX still. Who knows? Well, yeah, again, another massive subject. What other options have you got? Obviously, you could go persistent. You can use the same tooling you've got today for your desktop and laptop estate. Lovely. Are you comfortable doing this? Are you being forced to move off of legacy tech? Maybe you are. I think a lot of us are. Intune, obviously, is the go-to for this, for managing your persistent estate. Speaking to a number of other large regulated firms, they're still seeing issues with Intune at scale. If you have a failure rate or perhaps you don't see under the hood and you're not entirely sure what's wrong, you're probably seeing somewhere between 0.5% and 1% failure in large deployments, at least from what I've heard. If you're managing 1,000 machines, that's kind of manageable. If you're managing 100,000 machines, all of a sudden you've broken the service desk. And it also makes compliance discussions quite tricky. Again, as mentioned today, there are some better options around increasing that, what do we call it? Time to market, refresh window Neil's got a good video on YouTube, watch it, about how to kind of reduce the time on Intune. Now you can set it to, I think it's as low as 30 minutes, which makes, again, those risk conversations a bit easier. So yeah, maybe you look at Intune, but just be aware it's not a full catch-all, it's not super reliable. If you're lucky enough to have a large group of very similar users, like I said before, just install everything into your base image and use FSLogic's app masking or something to mask it off. You're going to get really good app compat, and you're going to get really good performance because everything's installed in the base image. Ultimately, the takeaway from here is I can't help you with your apps. Most of the approaches are going to be a trade-off. The standard triangle, performance, manageability, and flexibility, you're going to have to choose 2 out of those. I'm really fast running out of time, so I'm just trying to think about what bits I chop out. User settings and files, there's a lot of native tools there. Obviously, we're all familiar with things like OneDrive, SharePoint and cloud, all that kind of stuff. Apps that require lots of changes to files. Certainly I've not seen it, but I'm aware of it. Things like CAD space, anything like that. Do not put that on OneDrive. You will break OneDrive, you will break your user, you will lose data. It will be really bad, don't do it. So for your user settings and files, be sure you're obviously finding the most suitable kind of solution for those problems. Legacy solutions, you know what? If you've got some things that are deemed to be legacy tech, if it'll get you out of a spot, do it. DFSN, very legacy, actually pretty reliable. If it gets you out of a spot in terms of kind of regional failover, all that kind of stuff, just use it. That would be my takeaway. Storage. Again, got a million choices in Azure. There's 101 ways you can get storage. You can go to third-party SDS vendors. Again, choose for suitability. Be aware of some hard limits. Specifically, we have had some quite serious problems with Azure Files Premium due to the fact that it is not a native SMB service. It is a metadata service sat on top of object storage, and we've had to massively scale out some of our areas to ensure that we don't come across some of those hard limits. So in terms of simultaneous file access, you're currently limited to 2,000 items against a file. As soon as you get to 2001, horrible things start happening. So if you've got config files that are shared between lots of different machines, probably look at scaling out your storage rather than pointing everything at the same thing and everything going down. Again, legacy tech, if you have some legacy solutions that are available and you're confident with them and it'll get you over the hump, you know what, don't be afraid to use those if you're familiar. I think a lot of us are being pushed to deliver stuff really quickly, so if there's stuff that works for you, just use it on the understanding that it is a tech debt that you're going to need to get rid of, but if it will enable you to move more quickly in the beginning, just go and do it. Final slide, monitoring day 2 ops. I said I was going to skip if I run out of time, but I'll go over it really quickly just because there's always a danger of focusing on delivery. Yes, you need to deliver, but also once you've delivered it, you've got an entire environment to run for 100,000 users. So make sure you respect your ops teams. I think it's really difficult to run away with stuff. If you work in a segregated environment, to not involve the ops teams early on enough, they will be a super resource for you to use in terms of being able to provide feedback about how the platform's working and also raising issues that you probably weren't aware of in the first place. Supportability is absolutely key. Obviously, be aware that if you're moving to cloud, you are going to lose some of the nice things that you're potentially used to on-prem in terms of observability. So yeah, even with things like Citrix Cloud, we've had to build our own tools to kind of support some of that user estate. So be aware that there is probably a scope for that. That goes hand in hand with the kind of immaturity thing. There's quite a lot of gaps in some of the native services that are available for monitoring in Azure. Again, third-party tooling such as Nerdio, Control RPG Innovations can kind of smooth your transition to cloud by providing out-of-box metrics for you or custom dashboards. Or if you're already using stuff like Control RPG Innovations on-prem, use it in cloud. Makes sense. That's it. No time for Q&A.